power, where we know information is power. And so we have a wonderful guest today who we will be introducing here shortly. And so we want you all to stay tuned as our elder Ian speaks a little bit more about today's program. But before we transition over to him, I'm going to ask that we all just bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, we are so thankful for the opportunity to be here today, to be able to be edified by your word. We thank you for our guest speaker who is going to bless us and continue to bless those who are watching and hearing. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right, I want to thank Pastor Winter for that introduction of our series we'll be having here on Sabbath afternoons. I don't know how many of you remember, but we started about maybe 5 weeks ago. The first session, we joined hand with Park Hill Church, and Dr. Erin Burks led that effort where she had a panelist and they were discussing the vaccine and the effectiveness of the vaccine. And then the following week after that, we had Dr. Lincoln Maines, the urologist, and he talked about men's health, focused on prostate cancer. Then after that, we had Dr. Modest, who is also a former professor at the Loma Linda University School of Public Health. And she talked about how to maintain functional health during COVID, during the lockdown. And today we have a young doctor by the name of Dr. Shama Williams, and I will tell you a little bit more about him in just a second. Today he's going to be focusing on hypertension. So we have been having some real good programs, and these programs have been so informative. There are lots of great information. We have been learning information that we have been applying just to help, affect our lives, our total lives. So we've been focusing on health. So today we have with us Dr. Shama Williams. Now, just to tell you a little bit about him, he is the sixth of 8 sons. Mercy. I mean, I can just imagine what the household was like growing up, because there were 5 of us growing up, 4 boys and 1 girl. And it was a lively household. Amen. But anyway, Dr. Shama, he is the 6th of 8 sons born to Carlton and Benilla Williams. He graduated from the Bermuda Institute in 2003. He attended Oakwood University, and he graduated as a summa cum laude with a Bachelor of Science in Biology and a Bachelor's of Arts in Mathematics. So this is not just an ordinary brother here now. This brother has brains, okay? Brains, all right? Now, Dr. Williams, he attended Loma Linda University School of Medicine, my alma mater, School of Public Health. And this is where, that's how I met Dr. Williams in the Loma Linda vicinity. So he attended the Loma Linda School of Medicine there in Loma Linda, California. He graduated with a Doctor of Medicine. Okay, he graduated with a Doctor of Medicine in 2011. He completed his residency in internal medicine at University of Alabama at Birmingham Hospital before returning to Loma Linda University. So when he returned to Loma University Medical Center, he completed his fellowship in cardiology. So he's currently board certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine in both internal medicine and cardiovascular disease. He has attained additional board certifications in echocardiography, nuclear cardiology, and cardiac computer tomography. He currently teaches in the School of Medicine at the Loma Linda University and services as the cardiology clinic director for Arrowhead Regional Medical Center located in San Bernardino County, California. So Dr. Williams will be returning to Loma Linda University Medical Center to complete an additional fellowship in interventional cardiology in July of 21. So this is the written version. And just quickly, I've known Dr. Williams, we attended the same church when I was living there in California, the Mount Rubidoux. And I refer to Dr. Williams as the singing doctor. For those of you who know him, you know exactly what I'm referring to. And for those of you who do not know Dr. Williams, you need to hear him on the mic. This brother can sing, or to put it in our vernacular, this brother can sing. Okay. But he's a singing doctor, a really good friend. We've sang on praise teams together. So he's someone that I know. And I know you guys would not be disappointed today in his presentation. So without any further ado or anything like that, Dr. Williams, I just want to turn it over to you. Welcome to this presentation. Thanks for taking the time off to edify the members of the new community and Boston Street Seventh-day Adventist Church and whomever else is listening. All you, sir.
Hey, and thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you for the opportunity to be able to come and talk. Just gonna get my screen set up here, and then we're gonna just take a little bit of time to talk about something that's very, very important to me. And I am hopeful that by the end of this talk, you'll also find this topic to be a topic that's very important to you. So when I was 23 years old, on April 27, 2009, my life changed forever. I was actually in medical school at that time, and it was in the middle of exams. It was a Monday. I had just finished taking an examination in preventative medicine, which is a course that looks at ways to try and reduce disease burden and to try and encourage people to live a more healthy lifestyle. And I had gone to a friend's house to study for my additional examinations that were coming up. I took a brief nap, and then I received a phone call from my brother, which changed my life forever. On that day, that was the day that my father passed away. My dad, about 7 years prior, began to experience symptoms associated with a disease known as high blood pressure. At that time, 7 years prior, he experienced his first stroke, which occurred on Christmas Eve. Over the subsequent 7 years, my father had recurrent strokes, which slowly took away his mobility and slowly took away the things that he really wanted to do inside of his life. By the end of his life, when I went home for the funeral, I remember standing at the casket and saying to myself, I feel like I've been robbed. He was 62 years old. I was only 23. I was young. I wish I still had more time to be able to learn, to be able to grow, to be able to get some more life lessons from my dad. But that was taken away from me by a silent killer. But not just that, there were some things that I really wish my dad could have had the opportunity to see. For example, my dad missed the birth of his first grandson, his first grandchild actually, only by a few months. He missed weddings, he missed graduations, he missed lots of good times all throughout. And this was all the consequence of a silent killer that we'll be talking about today. So I want to pose a question to each and every one of you who's here and who's listening today. If I were to tell you that a murderer was quietly stalking you, how would you respond? Would you ignore it? Or would you try to take some precautions in order to ensure that you protected yourself and your loved ones? I hope by the end of this talk, you'll have formed a good answer for this question. Like Ann said, my name is Shama Williams, and it's a pleasure again to be able to talk with you guys. As a cardiologist, it is my life's goal to make sure that my patients get more birthdays, and that they get to experience more family get-togethers, that they get to experience more happy days, more graduations, and more weddings by being able to live a life that is healthy and a life that promotes healthy eating and healthy lifestyle habits. Today, I want to make sure that we are taking a 360 look around us as we consider our healthcare and as we consider the choices that we are making inside of our lives, because the choices we make today can have a drastic impact on our trajectories in the future. So let's talk about the silent killer. The silent killer's name is hypertension. Another name for this is high blood pressure. And here's the thing, even when high blood pressure or hypertension is very severe, many times it doesn't give any form of symptoms. And the other thing is the long-term effectiveness of having good blood pressure control can actually reduce the risk of complications associated with this chronic disease and many other chronic diseases. And so we must ask ourselves, why are we not doing more to protect ourselves from conditions like high blood pressure? Just for some perspective, high blood pressure or hypertension leads to heart disease. And inside of the United States, heart disease is actually the leading cause of death in both men and in women. About 655,000 or 1 in 4 people will die in the United States as a consequence of heart disease. And the cost of treating heart disease in the US cost about $219 billion each year between 2014 to 2015. Now, here's the statistic that blows my mind. This talk is scheduled to be about an hour long. That's 60 minutes. And in the next 60 minutes, about 100 people will lose their lives as a consequence of heart disease. So, why does high blood pressure matter? Because even though sometimes it doesn't cause any symptoms, it can lead to significant problems in your future. It can lead to heart disease, and it can lead to strokes. It's actually strokes that led to my father's death. In 2018 alone, 500,000 deaths in the US included hypertension as a primary or contributing cause of their death, and nearly half of adults in the US, which is about 108 million people, 45%, have hypertension or are taking some form of medication in order to treat high blood pressure. So you might continue to ask, why does it matter? Well, only 1 in 4 adults who have high blood pressure actually have their blood pressure controlled, which means that 75% of people who have high blood pressure don't have adequate control of this. There are in general more men who have high blood pressure than women, and there are more Black men and Black women who have high blood pressure compared to their age-matched peers. And here's the sobering part about this. Even when people are placed on medications, in general, people who are of ethnic descent and are Black, they tend to have much more challenging control in terms of their blood pressure when compared to age-matched Caucasian adults. So this is not just a disease that affects all people, it's also a disease that has disparity in the way that it attacks Black people and Black families. So what exactly is blood pressure? So you can think of blood pressure as the force that is applied to the walls of the artery as the blood is passing through the arteries. In general, your arteries are going to be responsible for carrying blood that's moving away from your heart, and it's going to take blood and nutrients to other parts of the body to supply the sources of energy that it needs to keep the tissues of the body alive. And in general, your blood pressure is not going to stay one number throughout the day. It will generally vary depending on what you're doing, and it will vary depending on the time of day. When you think of blood pressure, there are 2 components that are very, very important. The first component is known as the systolic blood pressure, and the systolic blood pressure is the number that would be on the very top when you're looking at a blood pressure reading. Then there's the diastolic blood pressure, and the diastolic blood pressure is going to be the bottom number. As I stated previously, it is the job of the heart to supply blood and nutrients to the rest of the body. And the way that the heart gets it there is by passing this blood through blood vessels. What generally occurs, there are two phases of the heart cycle, similar to the two numbers that we see on a blood pressure cuff. There's a systolic phase or systole, which corresponds to the portion of the heart cycle where the heart muscle is actually beating and pumping the blood. And that can be demonstrated by the red blood cells or the red color. Then there's diastole, where the heart is relaxing and the blood is actually returning to the heart in order to prime it for another heartbeat. In general, during systole, your heart will pump the blood out, and at the peak of systole is when you will get your systolic blood pressure, or the top number. And in this diagram, it would be represented by the portion of the blood vessel that seems like it's bulging. That's systole. The portion of the blood vessels that are not bulging represent diastole. And that's when the heart is relaxing and the blood is just moving by passive flow. When we look at how people take their blood pressures, there are different ways that it can be done, but there is a gold standard. In general, the gold standard that people should use is the blood pressure cuff that's located on the right-hand side of your screen. This blood pressure cuff is a blood pressure cuff that would be placed on the top portion of the arm, and it should be appropriately sized. As you can see in the diagram or in this picture, there's a top number or the systolic blood pressure. There's a bottom number or the diastolic blood pressure, which is in the middle on this diagram. And then on the very last number gives a heart rate. The image on the left is an image of a blood pressure cuff that's placed actually on the wrist. And this blood pressure cuff in general is not considered to be as accurate as blood pressure cuffs that are placed at the top portion of the arm. There are some people who may have reasons that prevent them from being able to get a cuff of appropriate size, or they may have conditions that prevent them from being able to put a cuff on the top portion of the arm. If you are someone that falls into that category, you may benefit from getting a blood pressure cuff that sits on the wrist. The reason why this is very important is because I think it's better for us to know exactly what it is that we're dealing with rather than walk around being ignorant of what could possibly be going on. It's important for us to know as well, because once we know, then we know how to act. Then we can do something to prevent damage in the future. So a lot of people ask this question, and so I want to throw it out there to you guys today. They often ask, well, how should I take my blood pressure? What is the best way in order to do that? And so this is a great slide to illustrate how a blood pressure measurement should be obtained. Generally, you don't want to smoke, exercise, or drink anything, especially not caffeinated beverages, within 30 minutes of doing a blood pressure measurement. In addition, if you're someone who has to really go to the bathroom very, very badly, at the time that you're going to be going to get your blood pressure checked, you should really empty your bladder first, because that bladder pressure can result in disparities in terms of your blood pressure. The other thing that's going to be very important is that you should rest in a chair with your arms supported for about 5 minutes. And you just want to sit there comfortably without talking. In addition, you want to make sure that you have your feet completely flat on the floor, because that's going to allow us to get the most accurate blood pressure reading. Make sure that you stay relaxed. Make sure that you are breathing evenly. Don't hold your breath when the blood pressure is being obtained. Once you get the cuff on, make sure that you don't put the cuff over any clothing. You have to roll up the sleeve, or if you're unable to do that, you might have to take off portions of your clothing in order to ensure that you can get the most accurate reading. The blood pressure cuff should be directly on the skin. This is a common mistake that I see, sometimes even in the healthcare settings, where people walk into the clinic and as soon as they walk in, a blood pressure is obtained, sometimes over clothing. This is not the appropriate way to do it. And so when you're doing it at home, make sure that you're doing it in the appropriate way. And if you're finding that when you're going to your physician's offices or when you're seeing your advanced practitioners, if that is not happening, just kindly request that they repeat the blood pressure in the correct way. And you can explain to them exactly what I explained to you guys tonight. The last thing is that you always want to make sure that your machine is well calibrated. And there are websites that you can go to just using Google, looking at validated blood pressure cuffs. And you want to make sure that if you purchase a cuff from CVS or from Walmart or from any other local pharmacy or for Amazon, you want to make sure that the cuff that you're purchasing is one that is validated and has been shown to be accurate in its assessments. So now that we know a little bit about what blood pressure is, it's the tension that's inside of the blood vessels that allows the blood to move from the heart to the other portions of the body. Let's talk a little bit about what high blood pressure is, or hypertension. In general, high blood pressure occurs when the force of the blood flowing through the blood vessel becomes consistently too high. The reason why this is a danger is because it increases the workload on the heart. It increases the workload on the heart. And by increasing the workload on the heart and the blood vessels can become less efficient in the process. In addition to that, over time, with continued high blood pressure, you begin to get damage of the inner linings of the blood vessels. You can think of it similar to the way that you think of a hose. Over time, using a hose over and over and over again, the hose may begin to start to leak or to get damage inside of the hose. This is true for your blood vessels as well. With time, the force and the friction inside of the blood vessels causes very, very small tears to develop inside the blood vessels. Once those tears develop, cholesterol can build up along the inner linings of these tears, and they can begin to narrow the blood vessels over time. The narrowing of the blood vessels has two consequences. It not only causes the blood pressure to get even higher, but it also restricts the blood flow to the organs that are desperately in need of the blood in order to do their necessary functions. When you have bad cholesterol that builds up in the arteries and causes narrowing of the blood vessels, this condition is known as atherosclerosis, or another way that people might call it is plaque. So I believe it's very important for us to establish and know what a normal blood pressure is and when we should be concerned about blood pressures, okay? So we're gonna go through that together with you guys, and I hope you're still staying with me. So in general, a normal blood pressure can be seen in this particular table by the green row that's highlighted there. So normal means that the top number, or the systolic blood pressure, is less than 120, and the lower number, or the diastolic blood pressure, is less than 80. At these numbers, the risk tends to be much lower when it comes to development of heart disease and strokes in the future. An elevated blood pressure is considered to be when the systolic, or top number, is between 120 and 129, and the lower number is also less than 80. So important things to keep in mind. But I think the most important one is the one that's in orange, because this is where the diagnosis of high blood pressure or hypertension is made. The diagnosis of stage 1 hypertension occurs when the top number is somewhere between 130 and 139, or the bottom number is between 80 or 89. So it's possible for someone to have a systolic number or top number that's in the normal range, but a diastolic number that is abnormal, and that is enough to cinch the diagnosis of high blood pressure. Stage 2 high blood pressure occurs when the systolic number or top number is greater than 140, or the diastolic number is greater than 90. And then finally, we have hypertensive crisis, which in general, we recommend people should consult their doctors immediately for blood pressures that are higher than 180 and or diastolic blood pressures that are higher than 120. Now, as I said in the beginning, when we generally think of high blood pressure, many people think that they should have symptoms associated with it. The actual fact is most people do not have symptoms associated with high blood pressure. And frequently, the symptoms that they do experience when they do are things like heart attacks and strokes, which can be very debilitating to someone's health. So finally, there's another category known as hypertensive emergencies. And hypertensive emergencies require you to call 911 immediately. And the types of things that we would look out for would be chest pain. It's not normal to have chest pain or to have shortness of breath, even if your blood pressure is normal. But if you notice that someone's blood pressure is 180 over 120 or higher, and they're also experiencing these symptoms, it's important that you call 911 right away. The other symptoms that are associated with hypertensive emergencies are back pain, numbness or weakness, change in vision, and difficulty speaking. Let's go back to the first two, chest pain and shortness of breath. These are also two symptoms associated with coronary artery disease and heart attacks. So it's very important to be mindful of these things as we think about ourselves and we think about our loved ones. Now, some of you might ask, which number is most important? Is it the bottom number or is it the top number? And the fact is, the diagnosis of high blood pressure can be made with either the top number, the systolic blood pressure, or the bottom number, the diastolic blood pressure. Generally, though, people who are over 50 years old, they tend to have higher levels of the top number or higher systolic blood pressures, while young people who have hypertension tend to have much higher diastolic blood pressures.
130, just another number, right? Think again. It can mean all sorts of bad things. Swimming is great, but swimming with 130 sharks is a bad idea. Ever been on a bus with 130 school children? You could be scarred for life. Gain 130 pounds. Get ready for serious health problems. And you might need a new scale. 130 is too much of a lot of things. And it's too high for blood pressure. A blood pressure reading of 130 over 80 or higher means you're more likely to have a stroke or heart attack. Visit heart.org/HBP to find out more about controlling your blood pressure.
So I accidentally just exited, so I'm just gonna bring us right back up to where we were. That was a message that was brought to us by the American Heart Association. Just a reminder of the importance of being mindful of one's blood pressures and ensuring that we do everything that we can to reduce blood pressure once we are aware of how high it might be. So moving along, when blood pressure remains consistently high for years and years and years, multiple problems can occur at the organs that are responsible for receiving the blood that's being pumped from the heart. And sometimes the organ that is being injured is the heart itself. So this is a graph that looks at coronary artery disease and the rate at which people die from coronary artery disease as it relates to their blood pressure and their age. So I'm going to try and make this really, really simple. On the horizontal axis of the graph, you'll see the blood pressures. On the left, systolic or top number. On the right, diastolic blood pressures. And then on the y-axis or the vertical axis, it looks at the rates of mortality associated at varying decades of life. And these decades range from age 40 to age about 90. One of the things that clearly jump out to me right away as soon as I look at this graph is lower blood pressures are associated with lower mortality. And as your blood pressures get higher, the rate at which people die as a consequence of heart disease goes up. Not just that, as we get older, our risk associated with development of heart disease and our risk associated with death associated with heart disease also increases. And it increases whether it's the systolic blood pressure that's going up or if it's the diastolic blood pressure that's going up. And here's the other thing. The same data is true when it comes to strokes and when it comes to people dying as a consequence of strokes. So on this particular graph, the horizontal axis remains the same. It's the blood pressure, both systolic on the left and diastolic on the right. And the vertical axis corresponds to the rate at which people die as a consequence of strokes. And it's going from various decades from age 50 to 89. And again, you can see that when the blood pressure is better controlled for any age, there's a reduced risk of mortality or death associated with having a lower blood pressure. So this is just a pictorial reminder that even as your blood pressure goes up just 10 or 20 millimeters of mercury, your risk can significantly increase. And so we need to be very, very vigilant, and we need to work hard to try and get our blood pressures down if they are not being well controlled. Now, since we took the time to talk about strokes here, I just want to put out a public service announcement so that all of us can make sure that we can know how to identify strokes. Because one of the things that's different about strokes is that sometimes when someone has a stroke, they are not in a position to be able to help themselves. And so it's incumbent on friends, on families, on church members to be able to look at a person and make a diagnosis and then do the next best thing, which is to call 911. So these are some of the things to look out for when you're looking for signs of a stroke. And the acronym is called FAST. F stands for facial drooping. Usually it's only on one side. A stands for arm weakness, and that also is generally on one side. S stands for speech difficulty, and this can be difficulty finding words. Slurring of the speech is also something that can be very, very common. Or word confusion or word salad, which means someone is just talking in a way that doesn't really make any sense. And you know that they're a person who generally makes sense when they speak. T stands for time to call 911, which means if you notice any of these findings in your friends or loved ones or in yourself, it's time to call 911 immediately. Because if they get to the hospital fast enough, there are things that can be done to reduce the amount of damage that can be caused as a consequence of a stroke. A second acronym has also been developed, known as BFAST. The B stands for balance, which means if you're dealing with someone who all of a sudden is unable to walk or seems like they are walking differently, that might be a reason to call 911. And then E stands for eye. If a person has lost their vision in one or both of their eyes, then this is something that should spark you and make you want to call 911 in order to make sure this person gets the care that they so desperately need in that particular situation. Now, here's the thing about high blood pressure. It doesn't just cause strokes. It doesn't just cause heart attacks. It can also lead to other things like vision loss, because it can attack the retina. The retina is in the back of the eye, and that's the part that collects all of the sensory data that we see. It helps us to know if the trees are green and whether or not we're looking at light or if we're looking in the dark. It can result in kidney disease or kidney failure. It can also lead to sexual dysfunction, which they probably talked about at one of the other, during one of the other topics a few weeks ago. Because the same arteries that can lead to the heart and brain are arteries that can also lead to these organs, and they can also become diseased or blocked. So I just want to take a second to show you some cool things from cardiology. I'm going to explain it to you, and then I want you to kind of see some of the things that can happen associated with high blood pressure. And we're going to spend the next 2 minutes or so specifically looking at the diagnosis of heart failure, or what some people call congestive heart failure. So this is a normal echocardiogram. An echo is an ultrasound that's done of the heart. Can you see my mouse, Ian?
No.
Okay.
Move it around again. Let's see.
I'm moving it, but let me do this.
Okay, yeah, I can see it now. Yes.
Okay, so you can see it?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So this is an image of the heart. Where my mouse is, this is what's called the right ventricle. It's located on the right side of the heart, and it's the main pumping chamber of the right side of the heart. This is the left ventricle. It's located on the left side, and it's the main pumping chamber that sends blood from the heart to the rest of the body. And this is what a normal heart looks like. It looks like it's got some spunk. There's a lot of spring in there. It squeezes well, and it tries to push the blood outside of the heart. The next image represents congestive heart failure, or heart failure with the reduced ejection fraction. I'm going to orient us again. This is the right side of the heart, or the pumping chamber, which has lost a lot of its function. This is the left side of the heart, which is the pumping chamber that sends blood to the rest of the body, which has also lost a lot of both its tissue, and it's also lost a lot of its function. If you notice, it's not really squeezing as well as the prior image that you just saw. So high blood pressure is a condition that can cause the heart to lose its pumping ability. And that can be as a consequence of causing narrowing or blockages of the arteries of the heart, or it can happen as a consequence of simply making the heart get burned out because it's having to work way too hard. The opposite is also true. High blood pressure can also result in thickening of the heart muscle. But here's the problem. Generally, if you go and you lift weights, you're going to build lots and lots of big muscles, right? You're going to walk down the street and look pretty buff. But when it comes to the heart, when the heart is working against high blood pressure, the thickening of the heart muscle strips away the size of the heart cavity. And so now you have a pump that really cannot fill very well. And because it cannot fill very well, it's not very efficient. The main reason for that is that the heart has become very thick and the heart has become stiff. So you ask, and I'll answer, what exactly causes high blood pressure? Like, what do I need to do in order to avoid getting this disease, which sounds just absolutely terrible? And I'm so glad that you asked, because I'm going to tell you all about it. So generally, we can think of high blood pressure. It used to be called essential hypertension. I think it's such a bad name. It's not essential. It's not the thing that you want. And so they've renamed it as primary hypertension. Here's the problem. It's really poorly understood. Primary hypertension is the hypertension that most people have. There's most likely a component of genes, meaning things that you can't change. and environment, meaning things that you can change. And then there are multiple compounding effects on the cardiovascular and kidney structures and functions that kind of create a cycle that perpetuates high blood pressure. So high blood pressure causes kidney damage and heart damage. Then that heart damage goes back around and causes more high blood pressure. So there are some risk factors that you should be aware of. And we're going to start with risk factors that you really cannot change. Some of those risk factors would be your family history. Your family is who God gave you because he thought that those people would be the best people for you to grow up and live with in order to save you. You can't change who your family is. This is what you got. You can't change the fact that every day you get older. We can't change who we are. We can't change our race. And we can't change, in some instances, the diseases that we may have been born with or the diseases that we have developed over time, such as kidney disease specifically. I know that sounds kind of depressing, but there's still a lot that we can do to actually reduce our risk associated with development of high blood pressure, or that we can do to treat high blood pressure if we already have that diagnosis. So the modifiable risk factors include lack of physical activity, unhealthy diets, especially diets that are high in sodium. And let me stop here. As Black people, we tend to be people who are much more salt sensitive, which means lower levels of salt result in higher levels of blood pressure for us. And so we need to be especially careful in the amount of sodium that we have inside of our diets. Being overweight or obese, drinking too much alcohol. I know this is probably not the right crowd to have this discussion, but alcohol can increase your risk associated with high blood pressure. Sleep apnea is a very, very well-known cause of high blood pressure, but it also is not often diagnosed. And the only way to diagnose it is to actually go in and see your doctors on a regular basis. High cholesterol and diabetes, smoking tobacco and using other drugs like cocaine or methamphetamines. And then modifiable risk factors would include your stress, meaning if you're in a stressful environment, ask yourself, do I have to be here? Is there a change that I can make that would make this situation more tenable? In addition to that, there are actually a lot of medications that can increase your blood pressure as well. And this might be an area where people are not as familiar. So if you are a young person and you are taking oral contraceptives, generally the oral contraceptives that have higher doses of estrogen can lead to high blood pressure. If you're someone who suffers with chronic pain and you tend to use a lot of over-the-counter NSAIDs like Advil or Aleve, when you use those for long periods of time, that can also lead to high blood pressure. Decongestants like Sudafed, which have pseudoephedrine or phenylephrine, are also known to cause high blood pressure. Antidepressants and atypical antipsychotics, glucocorticoids, which some people have to take because they have bronchitis or asthma, can lead to high blood pressure. Some weight loss medications can also do it. And then sodium-containing antacids, which people use for acid reflux, like Alka-Seltzer, can also lead to high blood pressure. So you might again ask, well, it sounds like this is really bad. Are you sure that there really are no symptoms associated with this? And the facts, if you're looking for symptoms or signs of high blood pressure, you're going to be disappointed. High blood pressure is largely asymptomatic. Most times there are no symptoms. But here's the thing. If you ignore your blood pressure because you think a certain sign or symptom will alert you to a problem, you are actually taking a very dangerous risk with your life. And so it is better to be aware of what's going on inside of your body instead of ignoring what's going on, thinking it will just all go away. Now, there are specific things that you can do to manage or prevent high blood pressure. Number one, identify the modifiable risk and correct them. as early as you can, as quickly as you can. Restrict salt intake to less than 1.5 grams. Here's the other thing about salt. A lot of people will say, I don't use table salt. I use sea salt or other types of salt. But you have to also make sure that you're taking the time to read the labels on the foods that you're eating, because the food labels actually tell the full story of what you're taking inside of your body. Now, we as Christians believe that our body is the temple of the living God. And so if our body is the temple of the living God, we should take the time to understand the things that we should put inside of the temple and the things that we should not put inside of our temples. One thing that can be done to help decrease blood pressure is to increase the amount of potassium that we have inside of our diets. And if we increase it to about 4.7 grams a day, it's been shown to have some benefit in reducing blood pressure. Other things such as weight loss, if you can decrease your weight by 1 kilogram, you'll shed about half a millimeter of mercury to 2 millimeters of mercury off of your blood pressure, which is pretty amazing. There are also very specific diets that can be used, such as the DASH diet. There's exercise that you can do. It can either be aerobic, where you're running or jogging or swimming, dynamic resistance, or isometric, which is more of your weightlifting. And in generally, we would recommend that you do this for about 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And then finally, there are medications that can be used to help treat high blood pressure. And here's the important thing. If your doctor has recommended that you take a medication for your blood pressure, it is vital that you take that medication. But it is also important that in addition to taking that medication, you make the additional modifications in your life that's going to allow you to live a healthier life. This is what I love to tell patients, and this is what makes cardiology great for me. I might start someone on a medication for blood pressure, but it doesn't mean that it's a life sentence. If we're able to have a conversation and we're able to work together to get you and encourage you to make changes in terms of your lifestyle, frequently, I'm able to get people to take lower doses of their blood pressure medications or be able to eliminate some of those medications altogether. Which means the onus is not on your doctor. The onus is on each and every one of us to do our part to make sure that we take care of this amazing body that God has given us. Now, if you recall, I talked about some potassium rich, I talked about the fact that potassium in the diet can actually help to decrease the blood pressure. And so here on this page, I give some examples of what some of these potassium-rich foods might be. Things like apricots and avocados, potatoes and tomatoes, mushrooms, molasses, greens. One thing I want to highlight is grapefruit. So beware with grapefruit if you're taking a medication known as a statin. Statins are medications that are used to help with cholesterol. And so you should really talk with your doctor before you start to increase the amount of grapefruits inside of your diet if you're on statin medication. Another important thing to remember is what I put at the top of this slide. If you have underlying kidney disease, it can be dangerous to increase the amount of potassium inside of your diet. So it is very important that you talk with your doctor before you make any changes to your diet if you fall into that category. Another cool way to try and help reduce your blood pressure is to put yourself on what's called the DASH diet. And another name for that is dietary approaches to stop hypertension. In general, the DASH diet is a diet that's high in fruits and vegetables, low dairy products, fish, poultry, and nuts, and whole grains. And it tends to be very low in more of the refined foods like sweets or sugar-sweetened drinks and red meats. And the way that the DASH diet actually works is because it's rich in potassium, magnesium, calcium, protein, and fiber, and it's poor in the saturated fats, total fats, and cholesterol. And so by doing this, we actually end up reducing the amount of reducing high blood pressure in a lot of our patients. So I want to take us back to when we were young. And I think some of you might remember this. And if you don't, it's probably because I'm too old. But this is something that my brother actually told me to include, and I thought it was kind of cool.
Well, me answer you straight when you're filling a plate, taking only cookies, all wrong. Cause you also got to eat fruit or veggies or meat if you wanna be healthy and strong. Yo, healthy food, boy, it tastes so good. Me one healthy dude, cause me eat healthy food. Me love it, boiled or stewed. Me love it, whole or chewed. You feel just great if you eat some healthy food.
Healthy food, Sesame Street. You guys remember that? So even from young, it's important that we train our children to appreciate heart-healthy lifestyles. And that's lifestyles that are rich in fresh fruits, fresh vegetables, whole grains, water over juices and sugary beverages. That heart-healthy lifestyle also includes ensuring that we get adequate exercise throughout our weeks and throughout our days. So let's dispel some of the myths, and then we'll go ahead and start to take some questions. Give me about 3 to 4 more minutes. So let's dispel some myths. Myth number 1, high blood pressure runs in my family. There is nothing I can do to prevent it. This is a myth. As we talked about, high blood pressure has multiple reasons. Some of it can have genetics, but a lot of it is associated with our environments. And so the choices that we make as it pertains to the activities we do and the foods that we put inside of us can actually make a big difference in helping us to control and lower our blood pressure. Myth number 4, I feel just fine. I don't have to worry about high blood pressure. Again, this is a myth, right? As we talked about, high blood pressure frequently has no associated symptoms. It is truly the silent killer. It spends years wreaking havoc inside of our bodies, and we're not aware of it until something major happens. So now is the time for us to take control of our lives and take control of our health and start to spend more time focusing on our blood pressures, not just blood pressures, but our cholesterol, making sure that our blood sugars are well controlled, making sure that we're getting physical activity. Myth number 6, I read that wine is good for the heart, which means I can drink as much as I want. Now, I know that I'm dealing with a community that in general does not drink. That being said, there may be people on here who are not part of our community, and so I want to dispel this myth as well. So alcohol has been shown to increase the likelihood of high blood pressure. It also increases the risk of people developing heart failure. So alcohol, while it's toxic to the liver, also has direct toxicity to the heart and can lead to weakening of the heart muscle, similar to the ultrasound of the heart that I showed, where the heart muscle really wasn't moving at all. In general, if you were to drink alcohol, the recommendation that the American Heart Association has established is that for women, it should be 1 glass or less, and men, it should be 2 glasses or less. Myth number 8, I was diagnosed with high blood pressure, but I have been maintaining lower readings so I can stop taking my medication. This is wrong. And let me be very, very clear. It can be dangerous to stop taking a medication that a physician has prescribed to you without notifying your doctor. So if you're finding that things are looking better, have the conversation with your doctor and let them know, I've made a lot of lifestyle changes. I would really like to decrease the amount of pills that I'm taking every day. Or If you're finding that you're having symptoms associated with the medications that you're currently taking, by all means, talk to your doctor and let them know about your symptoms, because there are multiple alternative medications that can be used to help treat blood pressure. So I want to end where I began. If I told you today that a murderer was quietly stalking you, how would you respond? Would you ignore it? No, I would fight back. I would fight back against the silent killer. And the ways that you can fight back, be curious. Take the time to investigate your health state. Find a doctor that you trust. If you don't like your doctor, fire them. Find someone that works for you. Because at the end of the day, it is your health that is most important. Know your numbers, know your blood pressure numbers. That means you have to actually check it. In general, we want you to get a blood pressure cuff and check your blood pressure every morning and every evening. Begin preparing today for your future self. Make decisions today that allow you to live a healthier life in the future, and make the necessary lifestyle changes in terms of a healthy weight, a healthy diet, decreasing the amount of salt in your diet, getting active, limiting alcohol, quitting smoking, managing stress, and of course, taking any medications that have been prescribed to you by your physician. And so at this time, I want to entertain any questions that people may have.
All righty. So we have a few questions here.
All right. Doc, if you don't mind, would you stop sharing your screen as well?
Yes, I think I did. Did I?
Okay.
Did I not?
All right. Excellent.
All righty. I was saying we have a few questions here. So when you started, you did mention that, you know, high blood pressure is more prevalent in Black men. I wanted to know, so why is that the case? You know, is it higher, comparing Black men and Black female, is it higher in Black men as opposed to Black females? And we know that it's higher overall as far as where ethnicity is concerned. Black people just tend to have higher blood pressure overall. So the question is, why is that?
So I wish I knew the exact reason as to why blood pressure is higher in man. Some of it could be related to the types of hormones that are simply inside of our bodies, like our testosterone. But what we find is that when we look at men tend to have a higher incidence of high blood pressure up until the age of 64. And then women after age 65 tend to have a higher prevalence of high blood pressure. And so in women, estrogen seems to be somewhat protective in helping to prevent them from developing high blood pressure. But once women get to their postmenopausal states of life, their risk also increases.
Interesting. All right, another question here. So apparently, you know, you did mention there's a relationship between high cholesterol and blood pressure. And it seems as if, you know, individuals that have a high blood pressure most times can be traced back to having high cholesterol, because there seems to be some sort of a correlation. So what about if an individual has assuming that the cholesterol level or the lipids level in an individual is perfect, but yet that person has high blood pressure, or someone who has high blood pressure, or someone who doesn't have high blood pressure, but yet they have high cholesterol. Can you explain that correlation a little bit more between both?
Sure. So when we think of the conditions that can lead to heart disease, the top ones would be high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes, and then a modifiable risk factor known as smoking. When it comes to high blood pressure, in the talk, we discussed how high blood pressure causes injury to the lining of the arteries. And that allows for cholesterol to get inside of the lining and then begin to build up plaques inside of the arteries. So it can come as a consequence of high blood pressure leading to plaque development, or someone with high cholesterol is more likely to have higher levels of bad cholesterol, which is available to deposit inside of the arteries. When the arteries get a significant plaque inside of them, it makes it harder for the blood to flow through the artery. And when the blood flow is restricted, the blood pressures can go up. So which comes first? It's kind of the chicken and the egg. But generally, we would treat both of them together or concurrently.
That sounds good. So you mentioned, the effect of potassium, and, that was enlightening because I didn't know that, potassium has such a resounding effect on lowering blood pressure. So the question is, what about supplements? And not only just for potassium, but you did mention, quite a few nutritional habits that could help lower your blood pressure. What about taking supplements? Would that suffice?
So I get this question very, very frequently. And I frequently throw the question right back. But I like to make sure that people are more aware. When people think of supplements, they're thinking of a medication that they can take in order to have an effect. And the fact is that a lot of the things that we do on a daily basis contributes to the development of diseases of the heart. And so rather than considering supplements, we should really be looking at what are we eating? What does our diet look like? Are we eating are we eating fresh fruits and fresh vegetables? Or are we eating more processed meals? That's an area where I would start. Now, when it comes to supplements, there are some things like garlic can sometimes be helpful with lowering blood pressure, but none of those things are a fix-all. You really need to take everything together, not just a supplement like garlic, but also you want to make sure that you are exercising, eating healthy, getting adequate rest, decreasing sugary drinks and sweetened drinks, drinking more water, de-stressing. That's what we get to do on Sabbath once a week, which is amazing.
Except for the pastor.
Except for the pastor. But all of those are things that work hand in hand in order to help manage our blood pressures.
Okay, yeah. If you have a few
I have
questions,
a few questions here, Elder, if I can.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Come in aware. So you mentioned, that having a stroke or a heart attack, if I recall, there's not always an obvious sign. So having a fibrillator in church, would you recommend something like that? Having those things at hand?
Absolutely. So defibrillators are life-saving devices that can be used when someone has an abnormal heart rhythm that could result in their death. And so having a defibrillator is like having an insurance policy. You never really know when you're going to need it until you need it.
Yeah. Wow. Well said, Doc. I got a second question here. So if you are at home, and now it's much easier for people to, I guess, focus on their diet to some degree because they're home more constantly. But do the online advertisement foods that you see, like Freshly and some of those delivery services, are they good for helping to keep your diet on a certain level and the salt and intake and all those things, or would you just recommend people just cooking for themselves?
So I'm not as familiar with Freshly, but what I will say is I recognize that it's challenging sometimes to be able to cook for ourselves. Our schedules frequently are busy, and some people can't cook. So that being said, the more important thing to me is that you are reading the labels, because the labels tell you the content of the food that you're eating. It gives you the information to know how much salt is in there, how much sodium is in there. And so that you can start to add up things yourself, and you can then begin to decide what it is that you really need and what it is that you don't need.
Okay.
And our goal would be to aim for 1.5 grams to 2.3 grams of sodium in our diet every day. Less than that would be the goal.
All right. Another question. There's one more question here. I have a few more, but let me just get it in while I can. So, somebody may ask, should I focus more on diet or exercise while I'm home during the pandemic? What would be your response to that?
What is the limitation to doing both? And the reason is, when it comes to exercise, it's not necessarily requiring us to do an hour of exercise every day. Generally 20 to 30 minutes. Most of us have 20 to 30 minutes of downtime every day to be able to do some form of physical activity. So I believe there is a way for us to do exercise and to look into our diets as well. Doing both. Now, let me put a caveat out there. If you are someone who has not exercised for a long time, you might want to talk to your doctor before you start a vigorous exercise program. Because remember, these diseases frequently are silent, okay? And so it would be important to make sure that you are healthy enough to start beginning a vigorous exercise program if you really haven't done it for a long time. Another reason not to start a vigorous exercise program would be if you are someone who experiences significant shortness of breath or chest pain when you're doing activities around the house or when you're doing things that increase your exertion, because those can be signs of diseases of the heart.
All right. All right. All right. I don't know if Elder Ian has any more questions at the moment.
Yes. Some question came in here on our Facebook Live. So I'll just read them. One here says, have you heard of the Middle Passage being a culprit of high blood pressure in blacks?
So I'm not familiar with the Middle Passage, but I would love to do a little more reading on that.
Okay,
It's
sounds
called the
good.
Middle Passage.
Yeah, and my mind was kind of centered around there too. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, and it's not only in this area of sickness, but black just, have a high, propensity for just about every sickness. And I often wonder if it has anything to do with the diet that the slaves were exposed to, and that just become a part of the genetics and pass on from one to the next. I mean, of course, only data can verify that, but it's just a thought I've had.
Were they asking about a Middle Passage? Was the question about a Middle Passage diet?
I'm not sure. It says, have you heard of Middle Passage? So if you're online and, perhaps you can clarify this question further, Joe.
When they say Middle Passage, are they referring to the slave trade?
So that's the thought I had. I could be way off,
So
that,
my understanding of how we lived in Africa is we lived off of the ground. We ate off of the earth. And then there's a lot of things, a lot of stressors that people of color experience inside of the United States, specifically. But there are also, I believe, some genetic predispositions, because it's not just people in America who have high blood pressure. We also have it in the Caribbean, and we also have it in Bermuda and other places. People of color experience this at higher levels. So there probably is some genetic component, but also there are microaggressions and stressors that people deal with on a daily basis. Just the grind of life that can result in increases in blood pressure that people are just not aware of.
Got it.
Yeah, and I can just imagine that being in the bottom of that ship was quite stressful. Yeah.
Okay, so I have another question here, and so this one says, what's the longevity when you get a pacemaker? you know. So having a pacemaker, helping in blood pressure, you know, because blood pressure affects the valves of the heart. But if you have a pacemaker, how would blood pressure survive, or what's the relation with having a pacemaker and blood pressure?
So generally, when we think of a pacemaker is put into the heart because the heart has lost some of its ability to regulate itself and beat on time or beat enough times per minute. Generally, we don't think of the pacemaker and high blood pressure as being directly correlated. The longevity for most pacemakers is probably about 10 years, 8 to 10 years, but it also can depend on how much you're actually having to use that particular device. Now, important things to remember with a pacemaker. In general, pacemakers should be checked by your doctors about every 3 to 6 months. So make sure that you are going in to your doctor's appointments and getting that device looked at. That helps us to know exactly what time we'll need to replace the battery on the pacemaker.
Got it. Very good information there. So the person that clarified the middle passage, I guess this was mentioned on one of Dr. Oz' show, and it says here that Dr. Oz says, the slave that survived had a higher propensity to hold water. So I guess this is going back to the middle passage question.
So
Okay.
I'm sorry. I believe that has somewhat to do with our genetic predisposition to salt sensitivity. So it probably has to do with the fact that when you're on a ship like that, you really don't have access to the most fresh foods. And so they probably used salt as a preservative during that time to preserve food for the long voyage. But as Black people, we are salt sensitive, which means when we eat too much salt, it increases our blood pressure, but it can also cause fluid retention because water chases salt. So that would be my thought behind it. I haven't read anything specific on it, but that's what I would think. I would love to look at what he said.
Nice.
Okay.
So I guess
Got a question. Is there any correlation? Is there any correlation between heart disease, heart failure, and kidney disease?
Absolutely. They are all correlated. So, and it really doesn't matter which one comes first. So if you have high blood pressure can lead to heart failure by causing both damage to the arteries of the heart and by causing the pump to fail because it's having to work too hard. It also can lead to kidney damage by causing narrowing of the arteries that lead to the kidneys. If you start with kidney disease, that means that your kidneys don't function quite as well, and the hormones that are inside of the kidneys that help to regulate blood pressure frequently are off. And so when those hormones are off, it can trigger development of high blood pressure, which then kind of creates the cycle from the kidney being the origin. In the setting of high blood pressure also leads to kidney damage. That kidney damage can then, heart failure leads to kidney damage. That kidney damage can then again turn around and lead to high blood pressure. So they are all very, very closely linked. And if we're managing people who have all of these conditions, we really are trying to manage all of those conditions at once.
Good. Okay, I have another question here. And I hope it says that if your high blood pressure is being controlled by hydrochlorosides, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, 25 mg tablet daily, could your kidneys potentially experience damage? On occasion, your levels rise.
So this is an excellent question. So someone has asked a question about taking a medication called hydrochlorothiazide. Hydrochlorothiazide is a blood pressure medication that has its effect directly on the kidneys. The way that this blood pressure medication works is that it tells the kidneys to stop reabsorbing sodium into the bloodstream. That causes you to lose more fluids when you go to the bathroom. And medications that cause you to go to the bathroom more frequently to urinate are called diuretics. And so hydrochlorothiazide is a diuretic. Hydrochlorothiazide can lead to kidney damage if someone becomes dehydrated. Because if you're making the kidneys get rid of additional fluid, when you're already dehydrated, you're going to decrease the amount of blood volume inside of your body, and that can cause damage to the kidney. So the thing to be very cognizant of when you're taking any form of diuretic is making sure that you're staying hydrated. Frequently, your doctors will say they don't want you to drink too much, and that's correct, but you have to drink an adequate amount of volume in order to ensure that you do not get dehydrated.
Good, good. So another question here, it says, who gets AFib? I guess in relation to the topics being discussed.
So atrial fibrillation is a condition that is an abnormal heart rhythm disturbance. So we can think of the heart as having 4 chambers. There are 2 chambers on the top that are known as atria, and 2 chambers on the bottom, which are known as ventricles. Generally speaking, when the heart beats, the top chambers squeeze first, and then the bottom chambers squeeze second. And that's the cycle: top, bottom, top, bottom, top, bottom. In the setting of atrial fibrillation, there's an abnormal heart rhythm that's coming from the top chambers of the heart. Rather than having a heart rate in the top chamber that's between 60 and 100 beats per minute, it can cause the top chamber of the heart to beat up to 300 times a minute. And when that happens, rather than having a good squeeze of the heart actually begins to shake in those top chambers, and that's called fibrillation. Because the heart is not squeezing very well in those top chambers, it can cause clots to develop. But in addition to that, since it's sending signals at 300 times per minute, it can frequently cause the bottom chambers of the heart to also speed up. And so the question is asked with regards to atrial fibrillation, kind of what is causing atrial fibrillation. So there are multiple risk factors for atrial fibrillation. In general, age is a major risk factor associated with development of atrial fibrillation. So if we all live to be 150, we will probably all get atrial fibrillation. But other risk factors for atrial fibrillation include high blood pressure, particularly high blood pressure that's not well controlled. Heart failure, meaning weakening of the heart muscle, is also a contributing factor to atrial fibrillation. Now, the reason why we as cardiologists spend so much time talking about atrial fibrillation is because atrial fibrillation also increases the risk associated with development of a stroke. That's because when that top chamber is just kind of shaking and not squeezing, it can cause blood clots to develop inside of those top chambers. And then those blood clots can move to other parts of the body. If it goes up to the brain, it causes a stroke. If it goes down to the leg, it can cause someone's leg to become cool and cause them to need emergency surgery in order to open back up a blood vessel inside of the leg. So frequently, our people who have atrial fibrillation are placed on blood thinning medications to reduce the risk associated with stroke.
Good. So you mentioned that, high blood pressure doesn't have any warning signs, so with something like that, would you recommend having a monitor in your home to test your pressure on a, systematic time frame?
So there are multiple options that are available to you. One that I strongly recommend, which would be in any adult who is healthy, they should be seeing their physician once a year at least. And during that time, they should be getting a blood pressure drawn to screen for high blood pressure. If you're someone who has elevated blood pressure, which means you don't yet have a diagnosis of hypertension, you should be seeing your physician at least twice a year for ongoing screening for development of high blood pressure. Now, I think it's also okay to have a blood pressure cuff at home because I think knowledge is power. And so you would be able to check your blood pressures at home. And if you see abnormal numbers, it should trigger you to reach out to your physician in order to schedule an appointment to have more discussions about what can be done to help you control your blood pressures.
So, Doc,
Go ahead.
I just wanted to know. So what would you recommend should be part of a regular routine for those of us who are in our early 30s? Should we be getting, screened for heart disease at this age? What would be, your recommendation?
So some of this is going to be based on your family history. So if you have family history of people dying suddenly or people developing heart disease very early on, you are someone who would need to have much more vigorous screening at an earlier age. But generally speaking, for healthy 30-somethings, we would recommend that they have a yearly physical examination, and at that time, they will have their blood pressures checked to ensure that they're not having any signs associated with development of high blood pressure. Frequently during those times, they'll also do blood work to screen for things like diabetes and to screen for cholesterol abnormalities.
All right, excellent.
So how far back would you say the issue of blood pressure goes back? Because and I'm asking that question because let's say 30 years ago, well, maybe let's go back 50 years ago. I would imagine that the diet would have been different. I noticed there's a lot of canned stuff on the stores, and sodium is needed within those canned food to keep them fresh. So is there any data out there that says, well, hypertension has become more prevalent in the last X number of years or anything of that sort?
So I don't know in terms of the data going back 50 years. What I can say over the past 10 years or so is that the prevalence is probably about even. There were some years where things were mildly less, but more recently, back in about 2017, there was a change in the guidelines as it pertains to the diagnosis of high blood pressure. And with that change in the guidelines, because they were noticing that people were experiencing end organ damage even at lower numbers of blood pressure. With that change in the guidelines, it actually significantly increased the amount of people who fall into the category of high blood pressure. And so that's where we get to the number of about half of Americans now with the diagnosis of high blood pressure.
Okay, good. The questions are trickling down now. So there isn't any cure for blood pressure, or is there? With taking medication, if someone has blood pressure, taking medication continually, is that a lifelong thing for someone who has chronic blood pressure, or with medication or even perhaps changing diet, will that bring a cure? So the main question is there a cure at all for blood pressure?
So that is an excellent question. If you look at medical records of people who have a diagnosis of high blood pressure, that diagnosis in the medical record will never go away. Once diagnosed, always diagnosed, but they may put a caveat that says controlled or blood pressures at goal. That being said, there are some things that can be done in order to treat high blood pressure. And those are some of the things that we talked about during our discussion today, which includes your diet and lifestyle modifications, weight loss, getting away from things like any types of alcohols. But then there are other things that can contribute to blood pressure, high blood pressure development, such as other medications. And so sometimes stopping medications that contribute to high blood pressure allows for that blood pressure to return to normal. So there are some situational things that can cause high blood pressure, and then there are some environmental factors that can cause it, and then there are some choices that we have to make for ourselves that can either make or break us in terms of blood pressure control.
All right, so I have just two more questions and then we'll end from there. So let's see if I can give justice to this question here. It says, if you have 5 parts of your lungs and know you have 4 parts, how does that affect the heart?
If you have 5 parts of your lungs,
Yeah, I'm not sure if they've left something out. This is one of the questions that just rolled in. If you have 5 parts of your lungs, so I don't know. Perhaps this may need some clarification. But yeah, well, we can move on to the next one, and I'll read it. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Ellen, and I have a comment afterwards.
Okay. So this is the other question here. It says some physicians now say that it doesn't matter which arm you check your pressure on. Also, that there is a new normal, not the standard 120/80. And that was pointed out in your graph.
so that's absolutely correct. So normal blood pressure is less than 120 on the top number and less than 80 on the bottom number. What was the first comment to that question?
Which arm? Yes, which arm?
Which arm? Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's 100% correct. So it really does not matter which arm you check it on. Generally speaking, if you're going between your arms to do a blood pressure check, there shouldn't be a discrepancy of more than 10 millimeters of mercury. So if you're noticing that you're seeing more than 10, a change of more than 10 when you're going from one arm to the other, that's something that you should inform your physician of, because it could be an indication of another type of problem.
Okay, Doc, I also want to say, as a pastor, I also appreciate your comment on some of the myth busters that you talked about, and one in particular about alcohol. Wine not being good for the heart. Mm-hmm. And I appreciated that, because from a spiritual perspective, from a pastoral perspective, the importance of not consuming alcohol seems to be dwindling, especially in our arena, within our realm. And the stance in which we used to have very strongly doesn't seem to, be there as it used to be, perhaps in the inception of our denomination and movement. And so to have some scientific data behind King Solomon's word, when he says wine is a mocker and strong drink is raging, and whosoever take part in is not wise. And so I certainly appreciate that, and I could see light in the fact that, one, the Bible is true in what it says, but God cares about us, and he wants us to be healthy individuals overall. So thank you for the Mythbusters. We may need to call up one of these segments, Elder Ian, the Mythbusters.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, we wouldn't take any more questions per se. I don't know if you have anything else you want to say, Pastor, before we close it out.
No, certainly. We truly appreciate you. We want to have you back, and we're so proud, my brother. You're making Oakwood proud. Amen.
Thank you.
Amen. 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 So yeah, I just want to thank you again, Dr. Williams, the singing doctor, the singing physician. I want to thank you so much for, taking some time off and just edifying us. This segment is called the Edification Hour, where information is power. That's right. We have been empowered today by your presentation. So I want to thank you, and I pray that God will continue to bless you, bless your practice, and that everything you do will be successful. So Amen. Without any further ado, again, I just want to thank you, and much blessings on you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk, Ian.
All right. And for those of us who are watching online,
thank you, Pastor.
We will tune in. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was going to say, for those of us who tune in online, I want to thank you guys also for tuning in. I want to thank you guys for asking the questions. Our segment is going to continue next week. We have another physician who will be on, and we'll be talking about women's health. So I'll see you guys on next week. So everybody, be blessed and take care. Thanks again.